All right, everybody. My guest today is Eric Hanft. Eric was the CEO and co-founder of a company called Key Square Labs. They've now been acquired by Ditto. Eric is now the head of public sector for Ditto, and this is an important conversation, and here's why. Eric's story is not the traditional venture-backed, everything was gravy from day one type of story. Yet, he's been extremely successful and made a significant impact on the mission of national defense. Key Square Labs was a bootstrapped operation, started small, 3 guys, R&D funding. They believed wholeheartedly in their technology and their mission. Eric's a military veteran. It's personal for him. He feels the problem acutely. Now, Eric went out. They tried to raise some venture. It didn't happen initially, but they kept going. And through relationships built over time that you'll hear about today, he was ultimately acquired by Ditto, a commercially funded Series B startup that is growing fast. They're well on their way to a bigger piece of the market. And that's unlocked a lot of opportunities for Eric and for Key Square. So I think this is an important conversation. I think it's an instructive one, and it's a unique set of perspectives. I hope you enjoy.
Thousands of companies show up to sell their technology to the U.S. Department of Defense each year, but so few will transition from proof of concept to true production across the valley of death. The select few who do, their stories are rarely told. Until now, I'm Noah Scheinbaum, and this is Crossing the Valley.
All right, here he is, the head of public sector for Ditto, the former CEO of Key Square Labs, now acquired. We got so much to talk about. Eric Hanft, welcome to Crossing the Valley. It's been a long time coming, man.
Yeah, I'm super happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Noah.
All right, I'm happy to have you. There's a bunch of stories we're going to tell today. I'm excited to finally get to lay out some of your experiences, man, because I think you've had a bunch. But let's start with you. We'll talk about where you are now. We'll talk about where you came from company-wise. But tell us about Eric the human and how defense and national security has been an interest of yours for quite some time.
Yeah. Well, I was not on this track when I was in high school. In fact, I was like a generally smart delinquent in high school. And my dad asked me when I went off to college at UMass, just please try ROTC. And I went there, tried it my freshman year, and I met the cadre, military cadre, and I saw a bunch of character traits that I wanted to have for myself. They're very aspirational. And that fundamentally was the moment that changed the trajectory of what I would do professionally. So I got a scholarship for ROTC. This is in 2005. So we're in the middle of 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was very clear everyone in that period of time knew kind of the direction they were going. But yeah, commissioned as a infantry officer in the U.S. Army upon graduation, served in a variety of light and airborne and Stryker units. I also had the opportunity to go to business school while I was on active duty, which on its own, if you can go to graduate school and be paid like your salary to be there, that's a pretty special experience. So
maybe the only time you should go to business school in 2025. It's unclear.
And so when I was there, part of it was just I had to go back to the military after. And so I was very focused the whole time I was at Stanford about what can I take from here and deliver back to the Army as a return on its investment. So there was an immediate element of that I was going back to a unit, and I did all kinds of stuff with Excel, and I would break our old government computers with some basic Excel functionality. But then longer term, I kind of came to the conclusion that I might be able to do more outside of the military faster than I could within. And with that decision, I was in DC. I started networking about what I would do, and ultimately met some folks who were seeding a company that was going to be called Key Square Labs, and I had the opportunity to join as a co-founder. So that's a very short synopsis, but in that time, I learned a lot in the military about leadership, about how technology felt to me as a user then, and how it might be able to be improved upon. And all that stuff sort of informed the journey that led into Key Square.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that your experiences in the military did not necessarily teach you about the delight of technology and how well it always works, but maybe about some of the other sides of it. I am curious, Eric, because it's not, everybody has a different approach to this entrepreneurial journey. Like, did you grow up wanting to build businesses, to start a business, to work in business. Where did the business piece of the interest come from?
No, to your first point, absolutely not. I didn't know. I don't think I necessarily did not want to do that. I just didn't really think about it.
You weren't a lemonade stand kid.
No, I wasn't an entrepreneur. And in fact, two funny things here. One, when I got in, when I applied to Stanford, I didn't know if I would get in, but they waived the admission fee for veterans. And so I concluded it was only going to cost me my time to take this shot. Then once I got in, I had major imposter syndrome because I fundamentally didn't know what business is. How do I articulate that? I don't know, right?
I think we're all still figuring that out, man.
Yeah.
The line is thin.
My message to any other vet out there who's going to business schools, I think foundationally it's a matter of vernacular and understanding the terms we use in the military and what the analog term for that is in business. A lot of it is the same.
It's always interesting to me because I think we see a lot of great veterans who go on to become exceptional founders or exceptional executives. And at the same time, there's this belief that military culture is rigid. It's operating within these 4 walls or 5 walls of the building. And so I'm kind of curious for you about that transition from, hey, I'm in a rules-based, very orderly environment to the world of entrepreneurship, which is there are patterns, there are lessons, but there's really no rules. So how did you make that mental leap from one culture to another?
Yeah. Well, when I was at Stanford, I specifically did not take any class in entrepreneurship because I was so sure that that was not going to be my path. Same time, with this idea that I wanted to go back to the military and deliver unique ROI from the time I had spent there, I latched onto this idea of intrapreneurship. So how do you do this inside of a large organization? The other thing that I had as a tailwind to doing that after business school was I kind of declared to my leadership that after I did my 3-year payback thing, I was going to leave. So that meant we were all on the same page about what was going to happen. And some of the ways you might be encumbered in taking risks in the military in terms of worrying about your evaluation and what your next job is going to be, I had shed all that, which gave me space for me that I needed, not to say that the next person needs that kind of framing, but yeah, I just started to look at problems a little bit differently in the Army and think, I understand this is the way we've always done it, and this is the way it's done everywhere else. But what if we did it this other way? So I think part of it in the Army is making sure that you understand the boundaries, but you sort of push on them. And there's more and more of this happening from what I can tell in the culture of the military from top down. Everyone knows we've got really smart people who want to do things. And also those folks want to experience some amount of agency. And so you can achieve both of those things, goodness for the institution and goodness for the individual, by celebrating that. It found joy in pushing norms and boundaries. I think that sort of slowly set me up to the idea that I think I could do this again, but in a more foundational way by starting or helping to start a company.
Appreciate that lay down. And maybe now let's talk about the company itself. You mentioned being at Stanford. There's ideas are a dime a dozen, to say the least. You have probably more classmates who are working on startups there than not, at least for the time that you are at the school. So talk about the vision of Keysquare Labs. Like, what was it? What was the company focused on? What was the problem they were trying to solve that captivated your interest and attention?
Yeah. So it was a combination of myself and 2 core technologists that each had created a novel technology. Our former CTO created a technology that managed your digital identity in an era of ubiquitous technical surveillance. And that gets into bits about what is your consumer device collecting about you? What is it transmitting into the network? And how do you create mitigations to that, technical ones? And the other side was this thing that we ended up continuing on with and that got acquired, which was a very foundational solution to a scaled requirement in what's now the DOW. So that was about, hey, we've got this custom piece of hardware that at the time of its sort of advent was not a problem because there were a small amount of users, but now there's hundreds of thousands of users. And we're still relying on this custom piece of hardware and all the supply chain and cost stuff that comes with it. And very few people even know about the technical underpinnings of what this was. We determined, hey, this is actually a really big scale problem that we could potentially solve with some novel software. And that was what was on that side. So to wrap those two things together, all of our efforts were about building novel technologies for the age of mobile connectivity, just in two sort of distinct lanes.
And were your co-founders also ex-military? Did they have that background?
One of them was and one of them wasn't. Both of them had extensive background in their domain areas.
Okay. So what were they thinking about it as their early user groups? You obviously took this in a strongly defense-oriented direction, but early customer discovery, early user testing, was that focused on the defense space or was that more commercial focused?
All of it was focused on the government space, but the ways in which we went to the customer were also different. So on a former technology I mentioned, that was going to the customer through another business partner. On the phone ATAK thing, which I don't really explain what the technology is, but that was directly to the customer. And I will say on that one, I quickly realized, coming from the Army, looking at the technology, I thought, the Army's the perfect customer. I'll go to them. Turns out that's one of the hardest customers that you could find in the world. But because what we were building was foundational to the use of ATAK, which is a government off-the-shelf software product that is open sourced and a prolific success story about the government building software, allies in Europe and elsewhere in the world were adopting this, and they were earlier in their journey and didn't have to sort of make this foundational reliance on a custom phone. And so, long story short, I found that there was actually significant demand overseas. I used a Virginia state-sponsored training program to go to an ITAR course and make sure I understood how to not break the law with that. And then I just started going everywhere all at once, because ultimately when you're a startup, you're trying to test the market, test the customers. So we would get a good feedback loop from these countries. I think we sold in total to about 8 foreign governments during the time I was at Keysquare. But yeah, the two different technologies, two different paths to market, two different approaches to revenue, all in a very small startup.
Yeah, a lot for a small team to do. I'm hoping you can crystallize it for us, Eric. In my mind, a user who had access or has access to Keysquare technology, what can they do today that they could not do yesterday?
Yeah. Well, on the digital management one, we have sold that. During the course of Keysquare, we sold that IP off. I can't really get into how that's being used or what those customers can do, but it proved to be effective. On the other one, which is super scalable and very commercial in nature, we got to rewind 2 decades to when ATAK, or Android Team Awareness Kit, was built. And, fundamentally an app that runs on Android. And the government needed a way to get the packet data from that app to move into the military network. And at the time, industry, there were some other requirements around it as well. At the time, industry said, hey, we're going to have to modify the firmware and the core IP stack that lives in all of our mobile devices, such that it has the right device drivers and routing rules and such to make this thing, military peculiar. And again, when you had a user base that was high-end soft, okay, we're not price sensitive. This is okay to create a custom piece of hardware. But as that has ballooned its fundamental user group, just in the United States, that custom piece of hardware is a limiting factor. That story I'm telling is representative of many other stories where we started with something special and it was okay at the time, but as scale was introduced, it's not okay anymore, and it's an impediment to our combat effectiveness. So what did we build? We took the custom firmware that provided those capabilities and reimagined that as a consumer application. And that really was an invention by a guy named Aaron Sikorsky. He encountered this problem when he was an airman, an enlisted airman doing comms for JTACs. And he had one of these custom devices and realized it's not super user-friendly. I can't take Android updates. Fundamentally, it's a pain point. And that's oftentimes the genesis of a great idea. How can I solve this thing? And so he figured out how to create the proof of concept and initial capability within the application layer. And then we just ran with that and tested it, put it in the field, put it into combat situations over the course of 5 years. And today, I strongly believe we have something that is more capable than that custom device is even today.
It's pretty neat. Think back about when did you get the sense, hey, this thing is working? Was there a certain team or certain user group? You're like, oh man, this makes a difference.
We're recording the 75th Ranger Regiment, and just standard startup hustle. I went on LinkedIn and I found the names of people who were the S6 at the battalions, and cold reached out to them. One of them called us back. The strength that we had and the luxury, and I know it's a luxury, is we're building software. This is a totally different game if you're building hardware. But with software, especially an app that can go on any Android device, we just gave them a time-limited trial. Now back then I used to cut 6-month trials, and I kind of learned a lesson because that gives plenty of opportunity to use the technology. But this is around, but we're working with them, and around the time that the Afghanistan withdrawal happened, and they had to go over there on a short notice thing. And I don't have all the details, but fundamentally they had a communications problem with their Army issued devices, their custom Android devices. And I think it might have involved interoperation with the partner force. But really the elegant story, Keysquare was out of the loop. Someone in the rear at Fort Benning in the Ranger headquarters in the communication shop was like, man, I don't know how to fix this. Like, I'm just going to send you this APK from this vendor. And the feedback we got was that they put it on 100 devices and solved their communication problem. And the backside of that, I'm like, that's awesome. And then you start to figure out, are you going to pay for that? But yeah, to your core question.
Like, thank you for that point solution. That was great. See ya.
Yeah, they ultimately did the right thing, ended up buying licenses. But yeah, that was the validation point, the first one. There were more and at bigger scale that came along the way.
It's a unique, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where I think the timing matters quite a bit, and so you're kind of maybe you're number 5, number 6, maybe 10, number 15 priority until something happens, and then all of a sudden, boom! Now you're number 1. You're like, okay, this is the environment in which I can grow and scale. So, it's thanks for sharing that one.
Yeah, and actually, I want to build on that point real quick because it's really important point for anyone thinking about entering this, the timing. Even in the Army, everyone would always talk about luck and timing. A lot of your success in your path as an officer can be based on who's your boss, what's the assignment, what is that unit doing something notable at that time. There's all that. And sort of the same thing experienced here when we built this technology and continued to improve it. And I would go to the enterprise and say, I think this is useful. It was just not, there were no SIBRs looking for a replacement to an existing program of record foundational technology. So that was hard. It was hard to find the right champions. But Russia invaded Ukraine, and that created another unique situation where the legacy way of doing things was not going to be suitable to solving the problem. And that things around that led to our first FAR-based contract. I'm just foot stomping what you said. You need not stars to align, but a couple of conditions to come together and to create the opportunity to showcase what you're capable of.
Absolutely. And then I think a lot of it is staying in the fight long enough to kind of reach those points, creating the surface area for serendipity. Eric, you alluded to your first FAR-based contract. What were your early deals? Like, did you start in Cyberland? Did you have OTAs? What were the first kinds of engagements that you had? Did you do vendor demonstration agreements, CRADAs? What vehicles did you all use?
I've done a CRADA. I did a CRADA Keysquare. We couldn't make much use of it. That's not necessarily blaming the CRADA partner, more of just we were small and we couldn't do much of that other than get TAC.gov accounts. The other sales we've done, I think they were all weird one-offs. The FAR was a sole source thing. So my only time I ever did a FAR contract was going through the J&A, having the government go through the justification and approval process. They did that very quick. We've never been in a competitive solicitation thing. There were never any SIBRs because I said people weren't launching SIBRs to try to replace what is a very common technical baseline across the Joint Force. The time when we did the Ranger Regiment thing, they have a procurement arm that is good at commercial procurement. So that was pretty easy. All of the foreign sales we did were very transactional. It was like doing a commercial sale. So some ways, I don't know. I probably never experienced some of the more common ways of dealing with the government. And then maybe the biggest opportunity that was rough as a effectively bootstrap, there's no VC money involved in any of this, was after we had done the unique support into the European theater, SOCOM, or actually really the TAC Product Center, Ryan McLean, who led that organization at the time, said, "Hey, we should have this for Title 10." And I was like, someone finally sees what I see. And he wrote up a APFIT paper that basically was going to have the government buy a limited rights license to our source code. So they would take it from us and never have to procure a custom end user device again. And it was a $50 million APFIT. So it would have been the biggest one that was ever done. But the math was pretty straightforward. We could basically say user count, what we were going to, what was the price that this would sort of distill down to per user, and what was the legacy comparison. Made it out of SOCOM AE approved it up, and then OSD passed on it. So that was the biggest contract that I was party to that didn't quite make it over the line, but part of the entrepreneurial roller coaster.
Okay, well, we can't move off it that easy. That's first of all, that's probably 10 years of life in 6 months or whatever the process was. What was that process like? I mean, we've talked about APFIT success stories here, probably some not successful. Not everybody talks about the ones that weren't successful, but tell us about that process. What did you learn?
Well, the first thing I learned is that the advertised upper limit for APFIT at 50 million was not the pragmatic upper limit in the government size. This is actually a good takeaway. Had we known that clear-eyed, we would have figured out some other proposal that was in line with the limit, and that could have changed the trajectory of how things went.
Just wait, so let me push on that, Eric. You're saying it said upper limit was 50. You guys asked for 50, and you thought that was too much?
The government, OSD, said, we're not doing $50 million. Regardless of if the math is obvious or not obvious, I think at the time, the highest one they had done was 20-something million. Okay. Now, that program has grown. They may very well have done a 50 million one by now, but this is back in 2023. The other thing that kind of changed too after that year is they got a little bit more interested in pairing software with hardware. This is part of the government's journey in figuring out how to buy software. That sounds like, well, of course, buying software is easy, but it's more about the FAR accounting rules and amortization of cost over time. And so, as far as I know, APFIT has now said, hey, it's got to be paired to some sort of hardware solution as well. But what was it like? I mean, from the moment when Ryan said, hey, I think there might be an opportunity for mutual benefit here for everyone involved, including the U.S. government, to scoping that, providing options. And of course, as an entrepreneur, you're like, man, this could be the biggest validation. Like at the time, the people working on this technology was like me, the founding engineer, and like one other engineer. And you're like, well, if I can create $50 million of value, like I'm going to feel pretty good about myself.
We're rich.
Yeah. I didn't share that process with anyone else except for the Keysquare board because it was so volatile and so like such an opportunity that I didn't want to force anyone else to go on this roller coaster ride because I knew how many pieces of this were fundamentally out of our hands. Like I talk about this.
When you say anyone else, Eric, you mean your own team.
Yeah.
So it was you and the board writing this APFIT. Nobody else is involved in it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was not like, it was solely because I didn't want to, we had our hands full with engineering. Like Keysquare by itself, it's like me, we had a non-engineer who worked on like the identity technology, but the rest of it was just engineers. So like they were always like at max capacity because we didn't have a bunch of like venture-backed funding. So yeah, wanted to take that one on my emotional shoulders. And then of course, like once it played out, we talked about it with everyone.
You alluded to the funding or the capital structure a few times, and I think it's probably worth chatting a bit about that, which is you guys made a decision to go a certain route, the bootstrap route. I mean, I guess just kind of what was the early days of that? Talk us through that decision, and then what did that unlock for you? What did that foreclose for you? Would you let's start there.
Yeah, I would say We started Keysquare with a known opportunity, a known research and development opportunity. And there was money to be had behind that. And so without that, there was, in the absence of any money, there's no way to start a company, particularly if you're going to bring in people who are not 20 years old working in a dorm room. These were very sophisticated engineers with very sophisticated technical backgrounds. So we started with this R&D money. And even for me, I mean, I'll be honest, I left the military after 12 years on active duty when I was 35. I had a wife and 2 kids. It would have been a different conversation if I'm like, hey, I'm going to go fully assume risk for all of us, me, myself, and my family. So we started with some financial comfort and some certainty that you would not find if you were doing the traditional VC thing. On the flip side, it got to a point where resources are sort of always constrained by how much that R&D effort is worth. And so there are benefits and trade-offs to this path. That's how I would sum it up.
Just make that explicit for us. When you said you started with comfort and certainty, that was R&D agreements? Those are an early question? Okay. So it was basically, we made the decision to start a company once we'd secured that R&D funding.
Yes.
Got it. But that was not a venture path. What was the discussion like inside the company? Did you guys ever think, hey, let's go try to raise some venture capital, or was that never a consideration?
Oh yeah, I tried. It was a few years in. So first few years really focused on research and development on all sides of the tech, fielding early versions, but very much getting a routine feedback cycle from customers about, well, it needs this, and this. About 4 years in, we decided, hey, this is going to require some additional capital to increase its chances of being successful as a business. And so we started this initial VC pitch effort, which was me, and it was my first time doing it. And I think one of the immediate things I realized is I was coming to VCs from a background that was not pattern matched to most of the companies they were investing in. And that in some ways provided us some strengths because we had 4 years with no VC investment to do things like, give our technology to the Ranger Regiment and have it solve a problem in a combat zone. Like have the government say, we want to buy your code for $50 million. Those were strong elements. That said, it was still a vibe of, this is weird. This is not the typical path. And I think it made it hard. And we could talk about this as much as you want to get into, but to fast forward to the end, anything from no to 6 months of interrogation, then no, fundamentally, that was the path. And that ultimately led to this decision this past summer that we would be better off joining Ditto.
We'll obviously get to the acquisition, but I want to stay with the raise attempts because, man, it seems like you pull up LinkedIn, you pull up Twitter, and it's like every, brilliant 17-year-old whiz kid in their dorm room is raising, $9, 10, 15, 30, $50 million to go after, name that. Now we're sitting on the hardware side, the manufacturing side too. There's, without us kind of pontificating on the reality distortion field that is social media, your experience in that, Eric, and you said you're not pattern matched. I mean, you're a military veteran who went to Stanford. In some ways, that is like the ultimate pattern, right? Maybe the company pattern was a little bit different, but there's a lot there that I think a lot of investors would like. When you talk about going through that process, being dragged through a 6-month process of where it's like, you're in purgatory waiting even for an answer. If you had to do it again today, starting from scratch today, let's say you didn't sell the company, how would you attack that?
I think I could have made some tweaks, early tweaks. I did this. I tried to raise for a year. And the first meeting I took, which was very clearly the first meeting I'm taking, right? I learned some things and I would have framed things a little bit different, but I don't know. No, it's hard. I don't have an obvious thing that comes to mind. I think beyond our weird origin, it might have come down to the problem and the intuitiveness of the problem. I think that's a really important thing. I mean, you don't get a huge amount of time with an investor. And if all of that time is spent with the investor trying to wrap their head around what is it that you're doing. That makes it hard when the next person to come in the door is like, I'm building AI, or I'm building a bomb, or I'm building a drone. I'm telling this story about obscure firmware-based solutions and trying to help them understand the scale. And it was just challenging. So I guess my message to, anyone out there is the intuitiveness of the problem, or at least how you can make it feel intuitive. I probably could have done better there. There's always ways to be better with that. But yeah, there was no AI, no drones, and that was a little tough.
Yeah, I think, look, if we were a little kinder about that, not every market is a venture backable market. Not every problem seems to be a multi-billion-dollar opportunity. It's possible that it is a really important solution that needs to exist and is incredibly impactful for the end user, and maybe doesn't fit the return profile of a venture investor. We talk about this a lot on the show. It's like not everything is the hammer that can, or the nail that can be hammered with venture. So totally reasonable. The other side of this, though, is you said you went after this for a year. There is one of these truisms in the entrepreneurship canon that is the difference between success and failure is the ability to stay in the fight and just keep going. But I also think there's a lot of truth to the people who say, and you also need to understand when to quit or when to stop or when to recognize that the market is telling you something, and continuing to bang your head against the wall in this case is the definition of insanity. What did you learn about the signals that gave you the conviction to say, no, we have to stop this path?
I would say after we did this for 5 years, I fundamentally believe in my heart that what we have built is going to happen. And it's not just because I think it's great technology. The signals around the world were strong. As I mentioned, we sold this to foreign governments, and there were other governments, not just in Europe, Asia, who were saying, we need this. At the same time, in the U.S. Army and Marines, we had some people who were unabashedly coming to me and saying, like, I need to go faster than the program offices that owns sort of the existing solution is doing here. And in the Army, that came to a head when it was a brigade commander email chain with me on it saying, how do we get what you're doing so that we can give this field, the chief of staff's initiative that the end user device is going to be part of the soldier kit. Like, we got to go faster than the institution is moving. So you take all that and it's like, I can't let this thing fail. At the same time, it's hard technology, and the resource thing became more and more of a problem as the interest sort of grew, and like active users, that was growing too, but the interest grew and the complexity of meeting all the needs was growing. It was getting harder to make this work. So the confluence of all of those things together, not to mention the financial aspect for like all Keysquare shareholders, it was not in, I came to believe it was not in our interest to continue to assume increasing risk that things would go to zero. That was part of the thinking. Now, we did not have to sell the company. And in fact, members of my board weren't initially enthusiastic about it. But I had met Adam, who is the CEO of Ditto, a few years back at a ATAK conference. And so we'd stayed in touch. And there was a personal element to this too, where I had implicit trust in him as a CEO, but he's also an engineer, to understand the importance of what we were doing. And so there was that into it. It wasn't just as simple as we have to find a buyer. It was, we don't have to find a buyer, but their risk profile is kind of rough. And we know of a buyer who I also know already. So it was like that.
There's a few things that I think are really important there, Eric, and I appreciate you laying it out because you even mentioned where you guys met. And one of the most common things to do, and I do it all the time, is bash on defense conferences and events. And it's all the same conversation, right? But at the same time, it is at those happy hours, it's over lunch, it's in the hallways where you just happen to bump into somebody and it's the start of a relationship. You see them again, you go to AFA, then you go to AUSA, then you go to Modern Day Marine, then you go to FCO West, and you just start building you see the same people. And there's actually, we make that almost sound negative. It's the same people, There's a strong positive too. There's the same people. You're actually building familiarity and trust. You see how those people show up. They tell you what they're going to do. They go away. You get to come back, see them again, and see if they've done that thing. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. The high trust relationships are super cool. What did those early conversations go like? Had he told you a long time ago that you knew he wanted to buy the company? So how were those early conversations? How'd they play out?
Yeah. Before I get into that, I want to make a point about conferences that I learned along my journey. So the big ones like AUSA, et cetera, I can feel pretty overwhelming when you're a tiny company that doesn't have a whole lot of resources. So you're walking the floor and everyone's got a big booth. And to some degree, the more money you have to spend on the booth, the more professional you look. And it looks like you must be legit, which is not actually at all sort of tied to end user value, but that's part of it. And I found myself gravitating to the smaller, more technically focused conferences, particularly if you're dealing with a technology that is not obvious to everyone. You can go there and find people who are not only trying to sell their stuff, but they're trying to solve problems with the smart people in the room. So that was the context under which I met a lot of other people, colleagues I have today who are very valuable, not just valuable to me as a network, but collectively valuable to the end user and the warfighter. Our first conversations was like, hey, Ditto is a commercial company at heart, but Adam's very passionate about seeing how we can apply the commercial intellectual property to defense and public safety problems. So that was the context. He was at a little booth that Ditto had, and I was walking around and said, what do you do? And feeling out each other's technology. It was clearly not the same technology. And you could also probably intuit pretty quickly that there were compatibility things that would be additive on both ends. So that was the foundation of it. But it was like touch and go with him. I would talk to him every once in a while. This is over two and a half years. So the point is maintaining these relationships with people who are very smart and are trying to solve problems in novel ways. That is a North Star that I think is good for anyone who's trying to build novel solutions for the Defense Department.
Yeah. So talk us through as the talks kind of heated up and you guys decided to move forward with it. You talked about this is the first time you started a company, is the first time you tried to raise money. Presumably this is also the first time you've sold a company. Mm-hmm. So that process, each of these, first of all, I'd love to compare the learning you've had the last 5 years with Keysquare to your learning in the classroom at Stanford. It'd be interesting to weigh the relative value there. But tell us about the process of going through that transaction and kind of how you thought about it. Of what were the must-haves, what were the nice-to-haves, where were the areas that you guys compromised a bit?
Yeah. Well, first of all, again, for anyone who's starting a company, the importance of having quality counsel is really important. It's going to culminate, all of the years of having quality counsel will culminate when you go to sell or go through some major diligence process. So we had quality counsel. I'm grateful for that. It was like drinking on a fire hose, and we were trying to do it pretty quickly. And I would joke internally with my lawyers that I felt like I was reading How to Sell a Corporation for Dummies, because it was just like not a lot of this is intuitive. Now that once you go through it, you're like, oh, well, I know this unique playbook. But yeah, it was all the normal stuff. We pretty much had what we needed and didn't have to, there were no moments of like, oh gosh, like we have not been doing this or we don't have this. It's just like learning the process, having our lawyers or coach me through it. My board members also were very experienced and wasn't their first time, which was extremely helpful when you get into like negotiating terms. You and I probably took Maggie Neal's class at Stanford, and like the key to negotiation is the ability to walk away. Well, that can be kind of tough if it's like the alternative is scary, but having some people on your side, whether those are advisors, board members, or even just friends and confidants who can help you stay grounded and step back a little bit, it was really important, because when you're in it, it is extremely stressful. You don't want it to fail. You don't want to fail for your side. And you ultimately, in this case, the acquirer is going to be my new employer. So you don't want to create some sort of bad relationship there. At the end, we were able to do it all. I'm super grateful to everyone who was involved in it.
So, yeah, thank you.
Oh, and I did not learn about that at Stanford, to your point.
Oh man, real world learning, man. We love it. So now at your perch at Ditto, head of public sector, what's your portfolio look like, and what's different in your day to day? What's similar in your day to day versus running your own company?
Yeah. I've got a lot more resources. And by resources, I mean there's more capital. There is a much bigger supporting team outside of engineering. And that's great. And early on, I felt myself sort of reverting to the things that I learned in 12 years in the military about how do you both lead, a more complicated multifunctional team, but also how do you operate within a larger organization? You're going from CEO, ultimately you're making the choices and owning them at the end of the day to, okay, not CEO anymore. I got to go back to, figuring out exactly how you fit in. I no longer worry about the existential survival that I had to worry about at Keysquare, and that's a huge deal. But there's new challenges that are mostly a function of increased complexity. In terms of what we're doing there, I mean, we're still doing the thing that we built at Keysquare, and then now I am, Ditto was always doing the application of their core database technology to public sector stuff. And what was great is while I was at Keysquare, we got selected for the OSD T-Rex 25-2, which is a OSD RNE based experiment. And Ditto had been separately selected for that event. So I was already planning to go spend 3 weeks at Camp Atterbury in Indiana. And it was started shortly after the acquisition, which was great because I got 3 weeks of focused time to study not only what the government was interrogating about Propagate, the technology that Keysquare made, but also Ditto's technology and looking at the competitive landscape in this sort of frontier technology evaluation event. It was a really great way to onboard to a company, really concerted.
Yeah, it's awesome. That's timing again, right? Kind of cool.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
looking forward, Eric, what's on the horizon for Ditto now? What are the big rocks you're pushing up the hill, and that's keeping you excited?
Yeah. So as I said, well, first of all, what Ditto's foundational value. Like, look at a hallmark customer that we're working with already, like Chick-fil-A. So if in the old way of doing things, when there is a central server required for your IT system to work, and then the internet goes down, many of us have gone into a store at some point in our lives, and they're like, "Oh, we're not taking credit cards. We can't process transactions or whatever because our IT system was too brittle because the connection didn't work or whatever." So foundational what Ditto's doing is saying, what if we didn't need the server in order to continue operations? What if we didn't need this central arbiter of information, and instead we can continue operations by using effectively a distributed database that's ensuring synchronicity across all of the nodes? The other piece they figured out how to do is make devices speak to each other without any other sort of overarching communications infrastructure using peer-to-peer Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. So that's the commercial sort of novelty and rocket ship idea. And it is a rocket ship. So then you look at that and apply it to DDIL, the broad, how do we operate when there's a sophisticated adversary that can get into and shut and disrupt our networks, like sever links or make links hard to use.
Cut undersea cables, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Effectively, we expect to lose the total connectivity. So how do we continue operating while that stuff is pursuing 4 core mission areas with that technology? One is command and control. So basically, how do you both ensure that we all have this idea of eventual consistency? So you and I may be temporarily disconnected, and when we reconnect, how do we make sure that our understanding of the data and the state of it is the same? Well, that kind of magically happens in the background between these nodes that are running Ditto. There's this sort of monitoring of a session state of, do you have what I have? Is it the latest? And how do we sync this up? The other piece to this is observability of the network state at large. And this is part of what we're building that's new is when Ditto's on all of these nodes, can a commander come in and look at, hey, can Johnny talk to Tommy because Johnny's got this piece of information and Tommy is the effector and I need to know if it's going to move or not. How do I know that? One of the things I saw when I was at OSD T-Rex is like, there's a bunch of network blobs. That's been the way it's always been. I've got all these nodes and there's these lines. But if I'm a warfighting commander and I look at that, I'm like, it doesn't tell me anything. So we're looking at how do we geo-reference this idea of network state onto a map, just like you would with blue dots, like where the people are. How do we talk to them? How do we talk to the robots? Those kinds of things. Also doing things around robotics, collaborative autonomy amongst a swarm. You can kind of imagine that one. Some things around critical data where, let's say we have an effector that's a robot or a human, and it needs an AI model that has a certain threshold of certainty for legal reasons. How do we know before we release this effect that that's the target that we think it is? Typically, that's been humans doing Bayesian analysis and things like that. Well, with AI, we're refining models until they meet some sort of threshold. How do we know that the model made it onto the effector before that effect is sent? Now, I always talk about voice, the way that I grew up communicating in the military. It's like, hey, Noah, this is Eric. I have this important piece of information, over. And the only way that I know that you got it is you come back on the other side and you say, Roger, acknowledge and whatever about it. That has worked in typical internet structures, but not so much when connectivity is intermittent. We can deliver this today with Ditto. And I think that's sort of the foundational idea, as the reliance on data and the production of data at the edge is becoming more and more. And you have Palantirs and Andurils who are chasing the same problem, but in some different ways. Ours is focused on this edge, this node to node server optional design.
It's a big, bold mission. It's an important set of problems to solve. There's a lot of space to run, man. So it's exciting. It's cool to see you at the helm of that as you guys get after some of this stuff. I know we're just about at the end here, Eric. So first off, we should acknowledge everybody. This is the first Eric Hanft podcast appearance. We're honored that it's with Crossing the Valley. I think your story is highly instructive in a number of ways that people are really going to appreciate. But I would just give you, so two things. First off, if people are interested in the missions that you've laid out now at Ditto and they maybe want to join the team, where should they go to learn more, or maybe to see some roles?
Go to Ditto's website. We've got a bunch of roles, and the public sector side of the business is also hiring. And the cool thing about Ditto is definitely a dual use thing. There's a lot of core, very, very smart technical skill. And so our public sector business borrows from that, tweaks it, kind of wraps it in a way that is suitable for public sector. That's the idea. So you get to work with a wonderful team.
Plug the website, man. Some people are driving their cars or they're running, so they're not looking at the show notes. Where should they go?
www.ditto.com.
There it is.
Ditto.
Couldn't be simpler. Love it. All right, Eric. First off, thank you for making the time to join us. Look forward to watching your success and hopefully having you back on here. I'll give you the last word. Anything you want to leave folks with?
If you believe in what you're doing, don't quit, but don't drive it to the point where failure is too likely. It's not worth it. There's no bravado or ego to be had or celebrated there.
And there's no participation trophies. There's only outcomes. Amazing. All right, Eric Hanft, Ditto, Public Sector. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, Noah.